Beneath the stars, the campsite feels safe, until the silence turns deadly. In early December 2007, the Apalachicola National Forest in Florida became the backdrop for a disappearance that would shake even seasoned search teams, because 46-year-old nurse and Bible study teacher Cheryl Dunlap was not someone who drifted off the map without leaving ripples, and when she did, her absence felt like a siren. She went into the forest on a solo camping trip, something she had done before with care and routine, and then the routines that defined her life began to break. First when she did not appear for her church commitment, then when her car turned up abandoned off a forest road with a flat tire and no sign of its driver. The vehicle looked like a story paused mid-sentence, personal items still in place, the seat empty, the trees crowding around as if they might know more than they wanted to say. Law enforcement responded quickly, and the search swelled, with helicopters flaring over pine and cypress, deputies and volunteers walking grid patterns through thickets and along waterlines, and dogs pulling at their leads in that focused way that tells you they smell a human truth. The forest is large, and the quiet inside it can hold a great many secrets. But quiet does not mean empty, and investigators began gathering threads that hinted at a predator moving through those same trees, a drifter who watched trailheads and parking turnouts for people who were alone. Days later, the searchers found what they feared, and Cheryl's body was recovered in the woods, not far from where she had last been traced. The brutality of the crime suggested a killer who did not act in panic, and attention quickly turned to a man who would become known across the Southeast, Gary Michael Hilton, the so-called National Forest Killer, a wanderer who targeted hikers and campers in remote places where distance muffled the sound of what he was doing. In Cheryl's case, investigators tied evidence and witness accounts to Hilton's movements, building a case that felt like watching a shadow resolve into a shape you do not want to recognize. And when the prosecution laid those pieces down in a courtroom, a jury saw a pattern that ended in a death sentence. Yet even when a verdict offers accountability, it does not automatically answer the questions that mourners carry. And Cheryl's people were left to reconcile the image of a woman who loved the outdoors and taught with patience and light, with a final chapter that felt engineered by someone who hunted opportunity rather than harboring any grievance at all. That is part of what makes the story so unnerving. The realization that she did almost everything right, told people where she was going, traveled with experience and intention, and still crossed a path with someone who had already decided the woods were his to use. The Apalachicola remains vast and beautiful, and most who camp there will leave with nothing more than the scent of pine and a memory of wind sifting through needles. But the glades where Cheryl was found have a different temperature for those who know the case. A notice in the air that solitude has two faces, one healing and one predatory. If you picture yourself pulling off that road at dusk, setting your small camp with practiced hands, listening to the last birds quiet and the last light drain out between tall trunks, do you imagine that silence as a comfort, or do you hear it as something that could hide footsteps that do not belong to you? Tell us what you think happened in those final days, and write your thoughts in the comments. The Appalachian Trail is often described as a long green tunnel where people go to test themselves against distance and weather, and to meet a version of quiet that city life never offers. And in May 1990, that promise drew 25-year-old David Coughlin and his friend Jeffrey Hood onto a Pennsylvania section with the relaxed competence of hikers who understood how to read terrain, how to make a tidy camp, and how to let their minds unwind when the fire burned to coals. The culture of the trail encourages a particular kind of trust, the greeting of strangers by nicknames, the swapping of food and miles and stories. And in that social code is a vulnerability that most days does not matter at all until it matters entirely, as it did when a drifter named Paul David Cruz began to hover within their orbit. Cruz carried a rifle and wore the kind of restlessness that makes other people's nerves tighten before their thoughts catch up, and he layered himself into their evening in a way that felt casual enough to pass but heavy enough to be remembered later. The way we remember details when we are asked to reconstruct a night in which everything changed. The attack came fast, a fracture in the pattern of camp life, the crack of a rifle replacing campfire talk, and Hood died quickly while David fought with the frantic intelligence of a person who knows that time is life, and that buying even a minute could mean the difference between a story told later and a story other people have to tell for you. Fighting an armed man in the woods at night is a physics problem with terrible variables, and after a struggle that must have felt longer than it was, David was also shot, and the campsite transformed into a scene that rangers and detectives would document in careful, sterile steps that never quite capture the terror that saturated the air only hours before. The manhunt for crews showed how swiftly a community can convert grief into focus, with law enforcement tracing sightings and footprints and gut sense to close the distance, and when they caught him and laid the evidence in front of a jury, the verdict and sentence delivered a kind of legal closure that could not change the calculus of risk on the trail. The AT remains beautiful, and thousands of people move along it in safety every year. But the story of David and Jeffrey changed the advice old-timers give to new hikers. An insistence that you carry not only gear and maps, but also boundaries, plans for what you will do if someone's smile feels wrong, and permission to end a conversation or leave a shelter without apologizing. Memorials to the men are simple and quiet, and hikers who pass them often pause without quite knowing why, because sometimes the landscape holds memory like a pressing weight, and you feel it even if you never read the plaque. When you think about zipping a tent in the dark, with a breeze walking the treetops and the night insects tuning their chorus, could you still surrender to sleep? Or would you catalog every sound and rehearse what you would do if a shadow pressed close to the light of your headlamp? Leave your view in the comments and tell us whether you would still trust the trail's quiet. In July 2015, Center Hill Lake in Tennessee filled with music, wakes, and festival energy as crowds arrived for Wakefest. And among them was 21-year-old Lauren Agee, a young woman whose photos from that weekend show easy joy, a social gravity that pulls friends close, and the kind of summer confidence that makes a steep bluff feel like an adventure rather than a risk. She and companions set their camp on a narrow ledge above the water, a striking place with views that open wide and a drop that makes you careful when daylight fades. And they spent the evening in the hazy orbit of a party that spills across boats and campsites and conversations that braid and break and braid again. By morning, Lauren was missing, and later her body was found in the lake below, dressed but without shoes, her phone and some belongings out of place, and a community that had been celebrating began to divide around a single stubborn question, accident or something else. Authorities leaned quickly toward a fall, a grim but comprehensible physics where a misstep in the dark on sloped ground leads to rocks and water and a failure to surface, and in many cases that would end the narrative. But here the narrative resisted being closed, because friends' stories did not lock together cleanly, and times and actions did not stitch into a smooth sequence. Her mother became a relentless advocate, and private investigators and online sleuths and true crime writers joined a conversation that sometimes clarified and sometimes only amplified the noise, pointing to bruising that seemed inconsistent with a simple fall, to testimony that shifted under pressure, and to the logistical puzzles created by the location of her body relative to the campsite and the shoreline. Civil suits followed, depositions stacked up, and the public learned more about the campsite, the people there, and the actions taken after sunrise than anyone would have imagined at the start. And still the center failed to hold, because plausible accident and plausible foul play both felt like they could inhabit the same set of facts. That ambiguity has made the bluff itself feel altered to those who know the case, a beautiful vantage that becomes a symbol for the way a story can tilt depending on where you stand. And festival goers who return to the lake talk about a prickle at the edge, an awareness that a place can be both stunning and treacherous without revealing which quality will rule on any given night. The official record has not named a killer, and many in law enforcement remain comfortable with the fall theory. But public memory often refuses to accept a single label when details do not rest quietly. And so Lauren's name continues to be spoken in the present tense of questions rather than the past tense of conclusions. If you imagine yourself on that ledge after midnight, with water black beneath you and a wind that smells of boat fuel and summer grass, Do you believe gravity alone wrote the end of her story? Or do you suspect a human choice tangled itself into the fall? Tell us which explanation fits the facts for you and share your take in the comments below. On the night of September 16, 2009, 24-year-old Mitrice Richardson was detained at a Malibu restaurant after behaving erratically and being unable to pay a bill. And what should have been a contained, protective encounter became the start of a sequence that still angers people who have studied it, because shortly after midnight, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department released her alone from the Lost Hills station without her wallet, phone, or car. From that door, she stepped into canyon darkness that is beautiful in daylight and indifferent after midnight, and the next reports placed her barefoot and disoriented in a nearby neighborhood, moving through yards like someone searching for an address that kept shifting in front of her. Then the reports stopped, and for 11 months her mother and supporters fought to keep her face in the news, organized searches that scraped at chaparral and creek beds, and pressured officials with the same question over and over: why release a clearly vulnerable woman in the middle of the night with no way to call for help? In August 2010, hikers found skeletal remains in a steep ravine less than 8 miles away, near an old campsite tucked into difficult terrain that earlier searchers had not reached. And the discovery delivered the cruelest kind of closure, the kind that identifies a body without explaining a death. The coroner could not fix a definitive cause, and every gap in the timeline turned into a pressure point, with some insisting that exposure and disorientation wrote the ending, and others arguing that the handling of evidence and the site conditions hinted at something more. Lawsuits and public records battles unfolded alongside grief, and Mitrice's mother maintained a steady demand for answers that could be tested rather than shrugged. The Sheriff's Department has defended its decisions, but the public portion of the story almost always returns to the moment of release, because it feels like a fork in the road where a different choice might have led to a ride home, a wellness hold, or simply time for the crisis to pass. The canyon where she was found remains a place that hikers describe as quiet in a way that makes you listen harder, a bowl of rock and brush that turns footsteps into echoes and gives back less than it takes. And for those who carry the case in their heads, it is impossible to stand at the rim and not imagine a lone figure navigating darkness that should not have been hers to navigate. When you think about being turned out of a station at midnight without the tools that connect you to help, do you see a tragic chain of misjudgments that ended in exposure? Or do you see something predatory entering the story off stage and exiting just as cleanly? Tell us what you believe and add your perspective in the comments. Campsites, trailheads, and quiet pullouts are meant to be pauses in a journey, yet these 4 stories show how easily a pause can become a vanishing point, leaving families to live inside questions that will not settle. If you want more accounts that make you reconsider the comfort of the firelight, subscribe, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments, and tell us which case unsettled you most and why. And remember, the most dangerous thing in a remote place is not always what is hiding in the trees. It is the part of the story that no one can prove.